So can we throw things open to the floor? I'm sure there are some pressing questions that you'd like to throw to our esteemed panel.
Right. Hi. My question, I guess, would be mainly for Ruth. Well, I guess it's more of an idea, like from Bernard's, building on Bernard's ideas. Like I really like that provincial idea of newsrooms around the country, and also obviously the breaking up Google and Facebook and taxing them, and but that seems quite hard, like it might be hard to do. But I've got another idea in terms of New Zealand on air and what they are able to. You were saying that there are there's the umbrella, and then it's broken up into 4 parts, and then and then funded accordingly. Is it something that New Zealand on Air might be able to do to all of those different things that do get funded? Could there be like an aggregating website that people can go to and know that they're getting, publicly funded, public interest content? Like you were saying with your Hey Hey for kids, but a little kind of general, which Hey Hey could be a part of, something that's kind of more general that you can go to and, know that you're getting something quality, something that your tax dollars have gone towards, and just something that's, because I find that, and it's great to know, I've got kids, so it's great to know now about Hey Hey, but also for me and my wife, we'd love to be able to kind of just be able to, and we're big consumers of RNZ content and multi-television content and whatnot, but it'd be great to have like a be able to go to a New Zealand on Air made site, for example, and whatever linear platform it eventually goes to, or is first on, or whatever. But the links, maybe it's just links through to their sites, or maybe it's like embedded in this. Yeah. Is that a possible idea?
Yes, it is. And it's certainly an idea the Minister's very keen on, in fact. There are difficulties with it, well, on the one hand, RNZ is probably the nearest to what you're talking about, that what we've got. The second thing we've got is New Zealand on screen, and when I say we, I mean all of us, is New Zealand on screen. My personal frustration with New Zealand on screen is that everything is just bits. So I was writing a speech one day, I wanted to watch a series of something, I thought, where can I find it? And the answer was I could find one episode. And why is that? And the answer is because whoever owns the rights has only given the right for that one episode. And to clear all those rights is a huge job. So it sounds easy to achieve, but in fact it's quite difficult because of rights. So for instance, I'm going to use TVNZ as an example, but not to disparage them in any way, but if TVNZ commissions a show, they're going to want you to consume it on TVNZ because their business is to corral their audience, and then they sell ads around their audience. So it's going to be difficult to get them to agree that it should be everywhere. And by the same token, if we're talking about the person who created the show, well, they're not going to want to have it everywhere either, because their opportunity is when TVNZ's right has expired, they can sell it again. And the content creators are not paid so vastly much. I'm really sorry, that's mine, I'll just turn it off. It's the intercom, strangely. How can I make the intercom go away? Like that. So it's quite a difficult idea. It's a bit like Bernard's answer, why can't we do the Facebook thing because we need 1,000 PhD engineers. It's difficult to achieve because people, buyers want an exclusive right and creators want a variety of selling opportunities. So could you force all that? Well, you probably could, but I don't know how that would work with TVNZ and TV3. It's never going to work with TV3. You could maybe force it with TVNZ because it's government owned, but it's a problem because it's their business model. So it's just complicated.
Yeah. Well, even if it was just sort of a link through to their, you know, how they have TV3 and TVNZ have on-demand situations.
Yep.
So, like, if there was an easy way to kind of, because I mean, a lot of what is on TV1 and TV3 and whatnot is such trash that I can't be bothered like trawling through it. But I would love to know which ones are publicly funded and therefore more likely to be funded.
Of interest to you, yeah.
So sadly, for most New Zealanders, the way that they do that, the way that they discover the good stuff, is to use Google, and then that hope that it's on one of these platforms like Facebook or Netflix. So I'm curious about, you were saying that Māori and Pacifica are using social media to consume their stuff, and if you were being really, you know, aggressive about distributing publicly funded content, you would literally give it to Netflix, or you would give it to, or put it up for free on Facebook, and you'd make sure Google could crawl it. And then the great irony of all of that is that the people who make the money out of it are going to be Facebook and Google and Netflix.
I mean, maybe I can just add something in terms of RNZ content as well, which is archived on the RNZ site, and the podcasts are archived. There's a massive information there. One of the issues that RNZ's had over the previous 10 years is a lack of funding to actually promote the fact that that material is available. We're sitting in Wellington. It's not a problem for Wellington because Wellington is so public sector RNZ focused that the audiences here are huge in proportion. RNZ under indexes in Auckland, which is why there's an advertising campaign for the first time in several years that has been put in place over the last few weeks in Auckland to try and encourage people to come in and test the waters. It is a completely different approach that's needed if we're to talk to Pacifica or Māori or Asian audiences, and that's something that needs a lot of attention. And you're absolutely right in terms of access to content. Mobile phones,
Yes,
massive.
absolutely. Big users.
And the irony is to get that news out there, what Radio New Zealand, and maybe New Zealand on air, would do to get the biggest impact would be to spend $10 million on advertising on Facebook and Google and using Netflix to get it out
becomes
there.
a whole circular argument.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of thoughts about this. One was the 2011 legislation repealing the TVNZ Charter, which also introduced some measures for dealing with what they called orphan works. That was programs where you couldn't actually find the intellectual property holder. So there was a set of rules about simplifying how you could legally access that content when you made an effort to find who the owner was but couldn't actually find them. It may be that provides some kind of a model for dealing with a wide body of publicly funded works. But I think there's a philosophical question that comes out of this, which is if public dollars made a particular program, should the public own it or should the person that produced the program own it? Because I think the model has shifted very, very firmly towards the idea that this is, that the program producers and distributors retain the primary ownership of that property. So if it's an independent producer that's made the program, they have a lot of rights invested in that, even if most of the money came from the public. So I wonder if that needs to be rebalanced in order to make sure that material is publicly available on demand.
So Ruth, has there been any consideration to this idea that if it's publicly funded, the ultimate ownership of it should be some sort of public archive accessible to the public, maybe after a period of a year or two when most of the commercial juice can be squeezed out of it, if you like.
Well, yes, there's New Zealand on screen, and that's what it's there for.
Bernard, I fully support your suggestion about provincial areas. Have you looked at the BBC model?
Yeah, so in the United Kingdom, some public money, I'm not sure exactly where it's come from, has been directed to the BBC, and the BBC have formed partnerships with news organisations in the north and the Midlands of England, which are relatively poor and underserved by commercial media. And they've built these newsrooms in which, the news is broadcast on local BBC stations, but then made available to local newspapers to republish and to local TV stations to use. And as far as I can tell, it's been successful. I haven't looked at it in a lot of depth, though.
I've looked at that recently also, and it picks up on your comment also about democracy and accountability, because in my work where I've been speaking with people about what New Zealand's open government issues are at the moment, this matter of lack of reporting of local government meetings has really popped up, and there have been several suggestions to me of corruption, backhanded payments, and everything that we say doesn't happen in New Zealand. And a factor in this is that there's very little attendance of local journalists and council meetings.
So that's a really good point. I was looking at Papers Past. Does everyone know Papers Past?
Yes.
It's a fantastic tool which lets you look at old New Zealand newspapers from the 1890s or whatever it is. And I was just bouncing around and I came across a report of the Motueka Rabbit Board meeting of 1893. And it was like this basic, the meeting opened at 7:03 and, Joe Bloggs said the rabbits were infesting his farm and blah, blah. And there were 25 people at the meeting. And obviously there wasn't a lot to do in Motueka in 1893. There was no Netflix or Facebook or whatever. So everyone was really interested in the result of it. There were 2 reporters there. They each did their own reports on that rabbit board meeting. And they were very factual there wasn't like, and here's the news from today's Motueka rabbit board meeting, Farmer Joe says there's been an infestation and they're going to do this and that. No, it was just here's what happened right from the start to the finish. You make up your own mind about what the news is. And there were 2 versions of it because there were local newspapers who covered all that stuff.
And do you know, they're still breeding.
That's right. That's right. And now there are major councils. The Auckland Council will have subcommittee meetings where no one attends it.
That's right.
And we know this is already affecting local government. So down in Westport a couple of years ago, it was Hokitika, I think, there was a council meeting where they decided on who was going to fix the flood problem in the Franz Joseph Haast area. Is it Franz Joseph, the little... Anyway, the councillors decided off their own bat that the real problem was that someone needed to get along with a bulldozer and build this big berm by the river to stop the flooding. No involvement of council officials. The councillor decided his mate would do the work, and they did it. And it turned out there was no geotechnical engineering, basically it was just done at the meeting, no reporting, and the Auditor General's just come out with a big report on how this was just an awful piece of governance. And the same with the issues around the Mangawhai sewerage scheme. We've heard about this, tens of millions of dollars spent on a essentially gold-plated water and water treatment plant that went through in the dead of night, no one knew about it, and then a few years later the rates went up because of it, and then everyone got outraged. Well, that was too late. And if there'd been some proper sunlight applied by independent local media, that might have been stopped.
Well, it's possible also the line scooter agreement in Auckland City was done rather less openly.
Yes. So sunlight is the best disinfectant, and sadly the sunlight is receding from a lot of our local places. To give you an idea, Here's a good little factoid for you. Back in 1968, there was 2 daily newspapers in Wellington, the Evening Post and the Dominion, now called the Dominion Post. 1968, there were 2 shipping reporters on the Evening Post. And the person who graduated from the Wellington Polytechnic Journalism School that year, his first job was as the junior shipping reporter at the Evening Post. There were 2 of them. And his job was to go down to the docks and, write up, this ship arrived, it's got stuff. If you're a shop, you'll need to know the ship arrived so you can collect your stuff. Or if you needed to buy the latest stuff, you needed to know that the ship had arrived and it was going to leave, and you probably need to put your stuff on it. And anyway, very important to know which ships had arrived and where they were going to go. It was a journal of record, very important. Now, you'd be lucky to have a transport reporter at the Dominion Post. There are whole areas that are uncovered. There used to be industrial relations reporters for the papers, no longer there.
I don't think that. Do they still have rounds in newspapers?
Often not, because they've reduced their numbers. And one good measure of this is in Wellington, I believe, from my checking of the numbers, there are less than 50 reporters actually on the ground reporting on things in local and central government and in the rest of society in Wellington. Less than 50.
And actually, Bernard, if you take the latest changes to stuff,
Yeah.
and the impact on suburban newspapers and those small local papers, the freebies, the giveaways that do a superb job in the local area, that's going to be significant.
And so what we've ended up with is this horrible misallocation of resources, I think. So less than 50 actual independent journalists, but there are, by my calculation, at least 300 people in professional PR and media relations for various government departments and local bodies and companies and various others. And those people are typically paid twice as much as the journalists. So we're looking at a ratio of, 600 to 50 of dollars being spent on keeping the news behind closed doors and people trying to get the news from out behind the closed doors. And increasingly, those media people are very frustrated that there are no places for them to tell their stories or to get the stories out. So they try to do it themselves through Facebook and Google and all sorts of things. Huge amounts of money spent trying to tell stories when there are very few people independently to do it. And of course, one of the things you realise if you're a young journalist very quickly is if you want to have a family and survive telling stories, you spend a few years in some traditional newspaper or radio operation or TV, and then you go into PR and get some real money. So that means you start to change the way you report on companies and governments, because you know you're going to need a job from them in a few years' time.
So Miles, you had a question?
I just wanted to question your idea, which is I think it's a really interesting idea about funding more regional journalism. The problem is there's the lack of non-commercial platforms for them, and I found when I set up my little news project that a lot of the regional media, for example small local newspapers, are utterly beholden to their local council for advertising, and they would not put stories that criticise the councillors in their newspapers. Now, that is going to be a problem no matter what you do, and for me it sort of echoes the problem we have in New Zealand, which is a shortage of platforms, a shortage of especially non-commercial platforms in all areas, and that's why you find, as you say, journalists are going to Facebook because they can't there's nowhere to put their content. So how would you get around that?
Yeah, no, I agree. There are not that many independent, widely available local platforms, so local newspapers or local radio stations anymore. They've all been hoovered up into
It's
the
not even
networks.
about being independent, it's about being independent of their advertisers.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a classic problem of the commercial media market. Their aim, of course, is to have enough scale and financial power to overcome that. Little example, so Newsroom is a relatively small operation. We have 15 journalists and we are funded by a mix of sponsorship, subscriptions and donations. And we've deliberately gone for that variety of funding sources so that we aren't beholden to our advertisers, if you like, to do that, and that's helped us grow our donations and our operation because people see us as not conflicted by those advertising sources.
You've also chosen advertisers that are mature enough to, I would imagine, maybe not, mature enough to allow content that isn't necessarily, commercial for them.
That's true. And a lot of those advertisers are very aware of the problems of public interest journalism withering, and that they, as organisations, actually need someone to ask their ministers or their CEOs or their competitors' CEOs hard questions. And that's an increasing thing we're hearing from a lot of our subscribers. A lot of people subscribe to Newsroom Pro or sponsors, is we desperately need independent, strong public interest journalism to protect our assets. And that's the other thing we take for granted in New Zealand. Gavin Ellis produced a good book called, I think, The Complacent Nation, is that what it's called? Yeah. In which he essentially said, we're all taking for granted that New Zealand is a free and open democracy with a clean legal system in which your assets are protected from powerful interests by the law. We all assume that'll never end and it's just a fact of life in New Zealand. Well, it isn't actually. We've all seen with what's happened with Trump and the likes, where powerful interests have used the fact that there isn't a strong democracy or a strong local media to screw the scrum of the law and of democracy to achieve their own ends. That's why there is now 1 million subscribers to the New York Times, because whenever Trump comes out and says they're failing New York Times, the promotions manager at the New York Times' subscription division goes, thank the Lord, because he gets another, what they call Trump bump. And unfortunately in New Zealand, and I think because of the failure of two large companies to understand the problem with the business models, we still have this view that we can get it for free. So NZME and Stuff, I think, have been drinking the Kool-Aid for way too long, that the internet is meant to be free. 5 years ago they should have started educating New Zealanders that you get what you pay for, so if you pay nothing, you effectively get nothing, and that's what they're getting now. And I would love it if they stopped drinking the Kool-Aid and started educating the public that if they want serious journalism, the public are going to have to pay for it, either directly themselves or through a shared institution like our government.
I think that's actually a huge factor, is that I'm not sure the public realise that they're at risk of losing the public media, and that's part of it, is unless they value it, they're not going to care.
So one way to cut through, and this is something I actually need to write, which is that New Zealanders have assets and they have jobs with incomes and they appreciate their assets. They know how valuable they are. So some people have houses if they're lucky and it might be worth $1 million or whatever. The reason that house is worth $1 million, if they're in Auckland perhaps, although there's parts of Wellington now that they're $1 million houses, is because the people in the rest of the world come to New Zealand and see until 2 days ago, a relatively safe, clean place where their assets are protected by a law and a democracy which is fair and functional. And so they put a high value on those assets because they know they've lived in places where there isn't that democracy, where the government can take your assets just because they want to. And if you fall out with some politician, Game of Thrones style, you're either dead or your assets are gone. And so they see New Zealand and they go, gee, if I put my money there, it's safe. And that's helped inflate the value of our assets. Now, if we were to lose that, and it would take a long time. We're lucky we've got a democracy that is unbroken since, the late 1800s or whatever it is. We've got a Westminster-style democracy that seems functional, and, we seem to work. We've got reasonably okay politicians and governments that don't do too much that's dodgy. But you give it 10 or 20 years where we create news deserts, where the people aren't watching, and human nature is what it is, power corrupts. And before you know it, we're going to have democracies that aren't as valuable, and our house prices are going to go down. And we're going to go, gee, how did that happen? Well, just if you want to see a sneak preview, just look at what's happened in the United States, the UK and Europe in the last few years. And a good example of that is the US elections. That scrum was screwed by people using Facebook to do all sorts of things, and malign forces like the Russian government used those tools to change the outcome. And now we have Trump. And if you want a picture of a democracy in chaos, just look at Britain right now, where again, Cambridge Analytica and various forces associated with the pro-Brexit campaign use Facebook and other social media to profoundly misinform an entire population. And you ended up with a broken piece of democracy, which they're now trying to put back together again.
So there's a question here, then a question there.
First of all, I'd like to say how much I appreciate the way really New Zealand has diversified its mode of disseminating news. I mean, being able to go onto my phone as I go to bed, listen to something via podcast is fantastic. Also, I'd like to say to Brennan how much I appreciate Newsroom and what you've been doing there. So that's just great, and it's a very reliable source of information. But my question to the panel is, given the fact that most people, or a great number, too large a number of people now, are getting their news via the corrupt sources of Facebook and YouTube, I mean, how are those monopolies, because that's what they virtually are in terms of the dissemination of news, how are they going to be broken up? I mean, is it through regulation by, say, the European Union, or I mean, the whole the federal government and the state's doing very much is pretty minor. But they are both based in California, where there's a relatively sane and sensible state government. So, I mean, where should we be putting our efforts into doing something about that corruption, which is what it is?
Look, I don't know the answer to that, and if I did, I'd probably be richer than Zuckerberg, but hey, I don't know where we go with that, to be honest.
I've got some suggestions.
Yep.
Easy for me to say because I don't have to get elected and I don't have any money at stake on it. But something really interesting happened on Friday afternoon, which most of you probably don't know about. When it became clear that this man had Facebook lived his massacre, and it was splintering out and in a viral way across the internet, as we were shown, and that many New Zealanders were stumbling across this horrible footage. Vodafone, Vocus and Spark got together. Now there must have been like a conference call between Simon Murter and Jason Paris and someone else, in which they said, we've got to stop this. And we all forget, we think of the internet as some sort of, unstoppable thing that's connected to the world, and there's a gazillion lines out to the world, and we just can't stop it, it's too big. Well, actually, there's only 2 pieces of glass fibre cable now that connects us to the world largely, apart from a few satellite providers. We could turn off the internet, and we can target the IP addresses for some of those networks. Now, they didn't do it for Facebook or Google or YouTube or Twitter, but they did it for a bunch of other really nasty sites. Now, I'd actually like to know which ones, but I think there would have been some of these, under the radar, nasty chat rooms and things where stuff was going on. We need to do some more reporting on that. But you know what? We could shut down Facebook and Google and Twitter in a moment in New Zealand, and I'd be interested to know whether we have the legal, or anyone has the legal right to do it. But
China does it.
China does it, yeah. Now, I wouldn't want to portray China as a model for any sort of, public interest, thoughts. That is a Marxist-Leninist dictatorship that has cauterized itself from the internet for its own reasons, mainly about protecting the power of the Communist Party. But they have actually shut out Google, Facebook and Twitter, and they've built up their own networks and tools to do it, some of which are quite useful. And we now I think, going to see a splintering of the internet. They call it the splinternet, where increasingly the regulatory forces and the geopolitical forces at work will start to cordon things off. And actually New Zealand is one of the few places in the world, because we have so few undersea cables coming to us, where we could do it. And that was very interesting on Friday afternoon. My personal view is, in the event where this stuff is happening, this hasn't happened before, so you couldn't argue we should have known it was happening, so we should have had an off switch. You know what, we sort of existed before the internet. We had phones, we had radio, we had television. In the event of a national threat, we should be able to turn it off. And I actually think that the threat of, because we can direct these telecommunication companies to do things. We have directed that little boxes be plugged into the back of their boxes to track all this information. That's what the acts passed, the TIXA Act passed 3 or 4 years ago, actually 5 or 6 years ago now, did. And we should certainly be campaigning for our politicians to regulate these companies to do the post-moderation publishing instead of pre-moderation publishing, and using the threat of turning them off to do it. Because it's an existential threat to our democracy.
I agree with the phone book.
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Sorry, is Facebook in the... No.
You can't contact
No. And this is the part of the problem. They are often quite sociopathic in how they deal with people beyond their borders. Even though many, Google has 50 people here working here now, and I know some very good people who work for them, and Facebook too have New Zealanders working here. And I'd love to be able to, pull them aside and shake them by the shoulders and say, this is your country.
It's almost as if the money that the billions of dollars that they make is the money they should be spending on censorship and managing their millions of channels.
Yeah,
or local content.
Yeah,
we know that the Australians are looking at regulating, or the Australians are always looking at regulating, because that's a tool that they've used actually to good effect, which we've chosen not to use. But tax the FANGs, regulate the FANGs. What's the other thing they're going to do to the FANGs? Yes, demand local content, which has already happened on Netflix in, for example, Europe and Canada. So they're not impenetrable. It's a matter of deciding to use the tools.
And they're not, when they're pressured, they do things. So a good example is France became increasingly angry about Google's failure to pay tax, and the fact that Google scrapes and takes all of the news in the world, indexes it, and then makes the money from your click from their search engine to the website, mostly. So the French, as the French do, went out on their own and said, right, we're going to put a special tax on you, Google. And Google said, oh, no, how about we give $200 million to a special journalism fund in France to do public interest journalism. And that'd be quite nice in New Zealand. 100 million would go a long way in New Zealand.
The threat of regulation is often the actual regulation itself that triggers an action that before you need the law. But I think one of the complexities here is we talk about, we should regulate Google, and actually we don't know what we mean by that. I mean, you could break it up, as Elizabeth Warren has suggested. That might actually not change the way it functions. I mean, you might still have a monolithic, effectively monopolistic search engine whose algorithms, for better or for worse, determine what we find and what we can't find. I mean, you could tax it. You could actually make it pay for some of the content which it takes advantage of, and make it funnel a proportion of its advertising revenue back into the content producers. Mostly the journalists. That could work. And then there are other possibilities for regulating the pipelines. You've already talked about the bottlenecks and where the telecommunications companies could actually intercede and actually stop access to certain Google or Facebook websites. So those are all possibilities. I think the bigger picture regulations for content are going to have to come from a multilateral approach. I don't think any one government can do it, and certainly not one the size of New Zealand. I think we'd need Europe to move first on that, or the US to move first on that.
We know they
before-
already
before
are.
you can do it.
I mean,
They are.
They
yeah.
are regulating Netflix,
Yeah.
so it can be done.
For Netflix, yeah, absolutely. But once you've got an international precedent, I think it becomes easier for New Zealand to do that.
But also it's worth asking ourselves
Yes.
questions about how we spend our own money. You know, our governments now spend, by my estimate, $100 million on advertising on Facebook and Google. And I'm guessing people that you've associated with or, you know, are involved in have spent money on Google and Facebook. We all use it. And at some point we're going to have to ask ourselves the question, have we done a deal with the devil that we're going to have to try and unravel ourselves from? And also, you know, we can pressure our politicians to pressure these companies and do things. We hope, yeah.
We had a question here.
I should say something a little about how I try and find out information, what news I try and read. I only subscribe to email lists. That is the only way I learn about things. Otherwise, there's my parents, who my mum will watch my news, or she'll watch TV. My dad will listen to RNZ. So they'll point things towards me occasionally. It scares me somewhat asking corporations like Google and Facebook to self-censor in response to allegations that Russia interfered in America's elections. They did, Google at least, did alter their algorithms, and from places that I get emails from, such as Thompson Now, Counterpunch, they're generally left-wing, they all claimed that their new internet traffic went down by 40%. So they were logged in there in the fight against fake news.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with having these monopolies is that once they're there and you rely on them to do your distribution, which we all now do, you are beholden to whatever things they change or don't change. And the cat's out of the bag, and now we have to try and stuff it back in.
That's why I kind of wonder about what. Let's imagine that Simon, Martha, and the other fellows had all said, "Yep, okay, good, we'll do it, switch it off." What would we have thought if our country was switched off from the world? What would we have thought about that?
Isolationism.
Me personally would have said, yeah.
Really?
Yep. Right. See, I'm
I'd be all in favour of that website, obviously, and that feed, but I don't know that I want the government telling me that I'm going to be cut off.
The other thing is, what's our immediate gut response when we hear that China is censoring the internet?
Yeah, and I'm no fan of China. I worked as a journalist in and around China. I know that it's not a fantastic place, but I actually think that decision, accidentally, to cauterise themselves from the internet, was a healthy one for their economy and their society. Secondly, it's been 20 years of me working with companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter. So I've been to San Francisco and New York, and I've talked to the executives of these companies, and they've said lots of nice things about how they're going to, do no evil, and how they're going to make it easy for journalists to get their news out there. And they've made this promise that you give us the news for free, we'll make sure you make plenty of money from advertising. And now I actually think they are, because they've broken all those promises and they've refused to change their ways when we've said, hey, do you know this thing is accidentally stuffed up here, you've made a mistake. They say, well, actually, we'll work it out, we'll find an algorithm or do some AI which fixes it. I actually think that we should no longer have anything to do with them because they have become these sociopathic monsters, and we need to turn them off. Now, of course, I'm not going to win any elections saying stuff like that. And if someone had turned off Facebook on Friday afternoon, which is really the only way you fix this issue, Facebook and Twitter mostly, there would have been outrage. How can you dare do that? Well, actually, how worse off would we be not to have
It's
this?
interesting. Facebook was down on Thursday, and did we?
The world end?
Yeah. In fact, I don't know about you, but I work on Facebook a lot, and I actually had quite a relaxing day Thursday.
Yeah, I mean, so you're right, Ruth, that would be unthinkable right now. But I think in a few years' time, particularly after what we've found out what's just going to happen on Friday afternoon, a few people were going, well, would it be that bad?
I think the other issue, if you compare China's ability to do it with New Zealand's ability to do it, the economic and population threshold difference between China and the ability to sustain the economic mobility is quite different to New Zealand's.
I mean, I'm not in a position to say rude things about the internet because that's where myself and my partner Linda is in the back there makes our money. But, and this is where Newsroom distributes its stuff. But actually, we'll look back on this period of the last 30 years with the internet as this giant experiment which looks like it has failed to do what we thought it would do. Make us all more connected and productive and informed about the world. There's a lot of economic research now saying that productivity, so per hour worked output, has pretty much halved since about 2007 when the smartphone was invented and rolled out. Because, for a bunch of reasons, we're spending a lot of time. I don't know if anyone looks at their iPhone and looks how many times they pick up. You get a report every week saying how many times you pick up your phone. It's frightening when you do it. And secondly, it's unleashed a bunch of globalisation forces that have made a bunch of people poorer and some very few people incredibly rich, which we know in the long run is bad for productivity and economic growth globally. And secondly, and it's very early days and I'm sure there's more research to be done, it has hurt the mental health of people who are heavy users of social media and their phones. And thirdly, it has demonstrably damaged the democracies, the biggest, strongest democracies of the world. Now, when you look back on it, so it's economically damaging, personally and mentally damaging, and democratically damaging. I actually think we'll look back and go, yeah, the Chinese were right.
I think we're going to have to wrap up proceedings, but I'm going to pick up on a couple of themes that we got from our participants in the audience. The gentleman over here mentioned that he didn't necessarily get his information using smartphones, and the gentleman over here pointed out he only gets his news through email lists. So if we're going to think about public media and a commons, a word that's been mentioned a few times, I think we need to ask the question, well, what actually do we have in common? I think given the terrible events on Friday in Christchurch, I'd be interested to know just how many people went to Radio New Zealand because that was the most trusted source, where they knew they weren't going to be fed false information. And I think the difficulty is, perhaps for people who aren't used to going to a regular traditional platform like a broadcaster or a newspaper, we're fragmented in our content discovery. You know, we're so dispersed in where we can access information, and there's the potential to get information only that I tend to approve of through feeds that tend to reflect my own views back at me, the so-called echo chamber, effect. And so one of the challenges, I think, for public media is to recreate a portal for New Zealand, where regardless of whether, your preference is for traditional broadcast or whether your preference is for mobile ubiquitous media feeds, online, you're going to be able to go to a site that will always give you reliable information and high quality information. And Radio New Zealand is certainly, I think, part of that answer. But maybe we need to be able to create a portal where all kinds of content, are available through a go-to first option for New Zealand. But no, maybe our panel could finish by commenting on that. Could we create that kind of portal for New Zealand? you know, the place where you always go first.
I think you could probably create it, but I don't think you could make the people go
That's
there.
right. That's right.
This young man here is not going to do that. And not because he's a difficult person, but because it's not his culture or his habit.
I mean, the only reflection I think I've got on that, Peter, is and this is another aspect actually that we haven't covered off in terms of public sector media and RNZ in particular, and that is when we talk about emergency management, civil defence lifeline. RNZ's a lifeline utility. When Christchurch earthquake, well, in fact, when the first Canterbury earthquake and then when the Christchurch earthquake happened, there was a massive jump in audiences for RNZ. Now that possibly reflects the fact that radio is your primary source of information when all else lights are out everywhere else. But I think it also reflects the trust for the organisation. Now that's not maintained, but it does give you a reflection of the need for trusted information from an organisation with integrity.
Can I just ask a question? I'd be interested to know how you found out about Christchurch and what you did when you found out.
That's a good question.
It's actually an event I had signed up going to said it was cancelled. It was given to me through a text, so it wasn't.
So it came to you through a text, and then did you have some interest in finding out, well, what is this thing?
Yeah, I went to RNZ.
You went to RNZ as well, yeah. Which is what I did, yeah.
There is hope.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing really that after all the changes that we still have this platform, which is in relatively good health and is able to use the tools that we have to distribute this stuff. And if you're looking for something to base your building of a portal on, or building a place where people could come that they rely on and trust, and that we all know is publicly owned, it is RNZ. And you know, you can distribute, and now that it's more than just radio, it's text, it's got a great website, it does podcasts, it does audio visual. Really, it's the only place left, sadly. Television New Zealand could have been that place, but unfortunately it's become a completely and fully commercial vehicle.
Commercial based, yeah.
I think we're going to have to wrap things up, folks. So very, very big thank you to Dr. Ruth Harley, John Barr and Bernard Hickey for coming along, and thanks very much to you all for participating. So a big round of applause for you.